She told the whole group what I said in therapy, word for word. And when I found out, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you talk so openly, you can't be surprised." What she didn't know was that I had every message saved, every single one. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with a betrayal. It starts with a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of Tuesday where the light comes in sideways, through half-open blinds, and you're still in your bathrobe at 10:30, because getting dressed feels like a decision you're not ready to make yet. My coffee had gone cold. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the mug like it owed me something. 3 weeks after Marcus left, I had finally made the call I'd been putting off for 2 months. I had an appointment with a therapist. Her name was Dr. Petra Haller, and her waiting room smelled like cedar and old paper, and I cried for the first 20 minutes without saying anything useful at all. I told Mia about it that same evening. Mia. We had been friends for 11 years at that point. 11 years of shared apartments and borrowed scarves and late-night phone calls, and the kind of honesty that only builds up over a decade of small, trusted moments. She was the first person I called when Marcus and I got serious, and she was the first person I called when it fell apart. She was the one who sat on my bathroom floor with me at 2 a.m. while I tried to explain why I felt like I was disappearing. And she was the one who said, "Go to therapy. You owe it to yourself." So I went, and I told her, and I thought that was safe. I should tell you who Mia is properly, so you understand what comes later. Mia is the kind of person who is always at the center of a room. Not because she's the loudest, though she can be. It's more that she has a talent for being the one people turn to. She collects information the way other people collect loyalty, and she distributes it strategically. And for 11 years, I thought that was just how she was with other people. I thought I was different. I thought I was the exception. I was not the exception. The first sign came about 3 weeks after I started seeing Dr. Haller. We had a group dinner. The whole clique, 8 of us around a long table at a restaurant we'd been going to since our mid-20s. Candles in the middle of the table, wine that was slightly too expensive for a Wednesday, the usual rotation of conversation. I was sitting across from our friend Carla, who I'd always liked but never been especially close to, and she leaned over and said something that stopped me cold. She said, "How are you doing with everything? Mia said you've been having a really hard time processing the relationship patterns from your childhood." I picked up my wine glass. I took a sip. I set it back down. Childhood patterns was a phrase I had used exactly once in my life. In Dr. Haller's office. In a session I had described to Mia, in a general way, not in those words, not with that framing, but Carla was saying it like it was common knowledge, like it was something Mia had mentioned in passing, maybe over coffee, maybe in the group chat, maybe as a way of explaining why I'd seemed off lately. I smiled at Carla. I said I was doing better, thank you. I changed the subject, and I started paying attention. The thing about noticing something is that once you start, you can't stop. It's like a sound in the walls of an apartment that you didn't hear until someone pointed it out, and then you hear it constantly. Over the next 2 weeks, I started cataloguing. Small things. The way Mia would bring up my therapy, in group settings, always framed as concern, always with that slight lowering of her voice that signaled intimacy while ensuring everyone could hear. The way she'd say things like, "She's working through a lot right now. We should be patient with her," as if she had been appointed my spokesperson. The way people would look at me with a particular softness that felt less like care and more like pity. The kind of pity that only comes from knowing more than you're supposed to. I kept telling Mia things, but I started being careful about what I told her and when. I started creating small inconsistencies, the kind that would be invisible unless you were tracking them. I told Mia I had discussed my fear of abandonment in one session. I told Carla separately that the session had been about self-worth. I waited to see which version circulated. Abandonment was the word that came back to me 3 days later from a third friend in the group, Sophie, who texted me a podcast recommendation about attachment wounds and the fear of being left. Sophie had never sent me a podcast recommendation in her life. She was doing it because someone had told her I needed it. So now I knew it wasn't accidental. It wasn't Mia processing things out loud without thinking. It was a pattern. It was deliberate. I still didn't say anything. I want you to understand why. Not because I was afraid of Mia, not because I doubted myself. I didn't say anything because I needed to understand the full shape of what she was doing before I responded to any part of it. If I confronted her too early, she would apologize, she would cry, she would reframe it, and nothing would change. I had watched her do exactly that with other people. I had sat next to her while she did it. I had believed her when she did it. I was not going to let that happen to me. I also called my friend Jana. Jana is not part of the main group. She's someone I've known separately from a different chapter of my life, and she has always been on the outside of the Mia circle, which I used to think was a shame. I understand now that it was protection. I told Jana what I had figured out and what I suspected, and Jana, who is methodical and calm and has the kind of quiet competence that makes you feel safe, said, "Okay, let's document everything." Jana was in the group chat. She had been added years ago and mostly lurked. She started screenshotting. Here's what was in those screenshots. Here's what Mia had been doing in the group chat while I was sitting in Dr. Haller's office trying to put myself back together. She had been sharing. Not everything, not in a way that was obviously a violation, but in a way that was unmistakable once you saw the full picture. She mentioned my breakthroughs. She mentioned specific fears I had named. She referenced a session where I had talked about Marcus and the dynamic of our relationship in terms that were clinical and private and mine, and she had translated them into group chat language and sent them out like a newsletter. She had positioned herself as the person who understood me best, who had the most context, who was the one to go to if you wanted to know how I was really doing. She had made my pain into her social currency. Jana sent me the screenshots in batches. I read them in order, sitting on my couch, that same cold coffee posture, that same sideways October light. I didn't cry. I had already done my crying about Marcus and about the year I'd had, and about all the things I thought I understood about my life that turned out to be wrong. I didn't have any tears left for this. What I felt instead was something very clear and very cold and very useful. I felt like I finally understood the full shape of the thing. I also had the voice messages. This is the part Mia had forgotten about, or maybe never considered. We had been sending each other voice messages for years, the way a lot of people do, because sometimes it's easier to talk than to type. And over the past month, she had sent me several voice messages in which she referenced things I had told her from therapy in a way that confirmed she was the source. She didn't say, "I told the group," but she said things like, "I just want you to know I've been explaining to people why you've been distant so they don't take it personally. And I told Carla a little about what you've been going through so she wouldn't be confused by your mood at dinner." Casual, confident. The voice of someone who has decided that what they're doing is a kindness. I saved everyone. The arrogance escalated in early November. I know the exact date because it was the day I came back from a particularly hard session with Dr. Haller, one where I had talked about something I had never said out loud to anyone, something about my mother and a specific dynamic in my childhood that I had been circling for years without ever landing on it directly. I was raw when I left. I made the mistake of calling Mia from the car because I needed to hear a familiar voice, and I wasn't thinking clearly enough to remember what I was dealing with. I told her some of what had come up. Not everything, but enough. 4 days later, Sophie called me. And Sophie, who means well in the way that people mean well when they've been given information they shouldn't have, said something about how she'd heard I'd had a breakthrough about my family of origin, and she just wanted to say she was proud of me. Family of origin. That is not a phrase Sophie uses. That is a phrase that came from a therapy session and travelled through Mia's mouth into the group chat. I called Mia that evening. I kept my voice completely neutral. I said I'd heard I was a topic of conversation lately. I said I was curious about what people knew. And Mia, who is at her most dangerous when she feels slightly defensive, said something I've replayed in my head many times since. She said, "Look, I'm just trying to help people understand you."
If you talk so openly, you can't be surprised when people know things. If you talk so openly, I had talked openly to her, my best friend of 11 years, in private, about the most vulnerable period of my adult life. And her position was that the violation was mine, that my openness was the problem, that I should have known better than to trust her. I said, "You're right. I should have known better." She took that as agreement. She shouldn't have. Lena's birthday party was scheduled for the second Saturday of November. Lena is the unofficial centre of the group in the logistical sense, the one who organises things and books restaurants and sends the reminders. Her birthday party was always a big deal. 30 people at her apartment. The kind of party where everyone who matters to the group is in the same room. It was the stage Mia had been performing on for years. It was where she was most comfortable, most powerful, most herself. It was where she would be expecting to be the emotional centre of the room, the one with the most information, the one everyone deferred to. I had been thinking about that party for 2 weeks. Jana and I talked about it carefully. We talked about what we wanted to happen and what we didn't want to happen and what the difference was between justice and spectacle. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want tears and shouting and a ruined birthday for Lena, who had done nothing wrong. What I wanted was for the truth to be known by the people it affected, in a way that couldn't be walked back or reframed or apologised into nothing. So here is what we decided. In the week before the party, Jana quietly shared the screenshots with 3 specific people in the group. Not everyone. 3. The ones who had been most directly fed information about me. The ones who had come to me with podcast recommendations and careful looks and knowing sympathy. Carla, Sophie, and Britt, who had mentioned my emotional walls to me at a coffee meetup in a way that made it clear she'd been briefed. Jana sent each of them a private message with the screenshots and a short explanation. She didn't editorialize. She just showed them what had been said about them too. Because it turns out, Mia had also been sharing things those women had confided in her. She hadn't just been trafficking in my secrets. She had been trafficking in everyone's. That was the second layer. That was the part that changed the shape of the whole thing. Britt called me the night she got Jana's message. She was quiet on the phone, in a way I recognized. The quiet of someone recalibrating. She said, "How long have you known?" I told her. She said, "I told her about my miscarriage in September. And she told me you already knew because she'd mentioned it." She hadn't mentioned it to me. She had used Britt's miscarriage as proof of her own intimacy with me, as a way of making herself seem more central. I hadn't known about the miscarriage. I found out about it in November, on the phone, from Britt herself. While she cried quietly and I sat there holding the phone and feeling the full weight of what Mia had built and what it had cost everyone around her. I went to Lena's party. I wore the green dress I'd bought in September and never worn because I hadn't felt like myself enough to wear it. I did my hair. I took the subway instead of a cab because I wanted the 20 minutes of motion and noise to settle into. I arrived at 8:15, which is exactly when I said I would arrive. And the apartment was already full and warm and loud with the particular energy of a party that has found its rhythm. Mia was there. Of course she was there. She was in the kitchen holding court, 3 people around her, laughing at something she'd said. She saw me come in, and her face did the thing it always does, that wide, warm smile that I had trusted for 11 years. And she crossed the room to hug me and said, "You look amazing. I'm so glad you came." And I hugged her back and said, "Me too." I found Lena first and gave her the gift I'd brought and wished her happy birthday and meant it. I talked to people. I had a glass of wine. I was present and warm and completely myself, which is something I want you to understand because it matters. I was not performing calm. I was actually calm. The work I had done in Dr. Howler's office, the work I had done alone on my bathroom floor, and at my kitchen table with cold coffee, had built something in me that Mia had not been able to access or destroy. No matter how many times she'd passed my pain around like an appetizer, the moment came naturally, the way these things do when you've stopped trying to force them. We were in the living room. Most of the group gathered and Mia was telling a story, the way she does, and the story was about someone going through a hard time and how important it is to support people and how she always tries to be there for the people she loves. It was a performance. It was always a performance. And when she finished, she looked around the room with that particular expression, the one that says, "See how good I am. See how much I care." Carla said quietly, "Is that what you call it?" The room shifted, not dramatically, just a degree or two. Mia looked at Carla with a small, confused smile. Carla didn't elaborate. She didn't have to.
Sophie was looking at her phone. Britt was looking at the wall. The three of them had not coordinated this moment. I want to be clear about that. They were just each sitting with what they now knew, and it was visible. The way things are visible, when you're no longer pretending not to see them. Mia looked at me. I looked back at her. I said calmly, because I had thought about this exact moment for 2 weeks, and I knew what I wanted to say and what I didn't. I think there are some things that belong to the people who said them, don't you? She knew. I could see her know. The colour shifted slightly in her face, and her eyes did a quick calculation, and she said, "I don't know what you mean," which is what people say when they know exactly what you mean. I said, "I think you do. And I think Carla does, and Sophie does, and Britt does. I think we've all had a similar experience lately." I did not raise my voice. I did not produce my phone. I did not read aloud from the screenshots. I didn't need to. The evidence was already in the hands of the people who needed it, and the truth was already in the room, and all I was doing was naming it. Mia tried to laugh. It didn't land. She said something about misunderstandings and intentions, and how she was just trying to help. And the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when everyone is listening, but no one wants to be caught listening. She looked around for an ally and found careful faces. Not hostile, not cruel, just careful. The faces of people who are reconsidering. She turned it on me. That was the next move, and I had expected it. She said I was being unfair, that I had shared things with her in confidence, and now I was making her look bad for caring. She said that if I had a problem, I should have come to her privately instead of making a scene at Lena's birthday. She said the word scene, even though I had not raised my voice once. I was the scene, apparently. My calm was the scene. I said, "I'm not making a scene. I'm just done pretending." That was all. That was the whole speech. 9 words. She left about 40 minutes later. She said she wasn't feeling well. She hugged Lena goodbye and said she'd text her, and she left. And the door closed behind her, and the party went on. People talked, music played, Lena blew out the candles on her cake, and everyone sang, and I ate a piece of chocolate cake and talked to a woman I'd never met before who turned out to be Lena's cousin, and who was funny and easy and had no idea who any of us were to each other. That was the most peaceful I'd felt in months. In the weeks after the party, the consequences were not dramatic. They were quiet and structural, the way real consequences usually are. Mia was not kicked out of the group in some formal public way. Nobody made an announcement. What happened was simpler and more final. The invitations stopped including her as automatically as they used to. The group chat went quieter in ways that reflected her absence from certain conversations. The role she had occupied, the emotional centre, the one everyone debriefed with, the one who always knew the most, that role simply stopped being filled by her. Not because anyone declared it, because nobody offered it to her anymore. She texted me twice in the week after the party. The first message was an apology that was mostly an explanation. The kind of apology where the person is very sorry that you feel hurt. The second message was shorter and angrier and said that I had humiliated her in front of everyone and that she thought I was supposed to be her friend. I read both messages. I did not respond to either. Not because I was punishing her, because I had nothing left to say that would be useful to either of us. I still have the screenshots. I still have the voice messages. I kept them not as weapons, but as documentation. The same way you keep a record of something that happened to you so that you don't start doubting your own memory of it later. I knew myself well enough by then to know that I would need them, that there would be moments, late at night, when I would start to wonder if I had overreacted, if I had been unfair, if the friendship had been worth saving. The screenshots are the answer to that question. I look at them when I need to, which is less and less often. Dr. Haller and I talked about Mia for several sessions. We talked about what it means to choose someone as a safe person and find out they weren't, and what that does to your ability to trust the next person you choose. We talked about the difference between being open and being naive, and how those two things are not the same, even though Mia wanted me to believe they were. We talked about what I had actually lost and what I had actually gained, and the math was uncomfortable, but not as bad as I had expected. What I had lost. 11 years of a friendship that I now understood had always had this possibility inside it. the possibility that Mia would trade my vulnerabilities for social standing. I had lost the version of Mia I thought I knew, but Dr. Haller helped me see that that version had never entirely been real. I had been in love with the Mia I believed in, not always the Mia who was there. What I had gained, the knowledge of what I actually needed from the people around me, the ability to distinguish between people who hold things carefully and people who hold things loosely. A smaller, quieter circle of friends who had proven, in concrete ways, that they could be trusted. Jana, Britt, who called me every 2 weeks now with no agenda. Carla, who had started texting me directly, instead of routing everything through the group. Even Sophie, who was still figuring things out but was doing so honestly. And the healing itself, which was mine, which had always been mine. I want to be specific about this because it matters. The therapy was working, not because Mia hadn't contaminated it. She had taken something private and passed it around and made it smaller in the passing. But the work I was doing with Dr. Haller was mine in a way that couldn't be taken. The insights stayed inside me even after the words had been borrowed. The understanding I was building about myself, about Marcus, about the patterns I had carried from my childhood into my adult relationships, that understanding didn't belong to Mia. She could repeat the words. She couldn't take the experience. By December, I had stopped going to the larger group events. Not because I was exiled, because I had stopped needing them. The big table at the restaurant, the group chat with its constant low hum of information and performance, the social ecosystem that Mia had been the center of, I had needed all of that less than I thought I did. What I had needed was to feel less alone after Marcus left, and I had confused that need with needing the group. The group was a container. It wasn't the thing itself. The thing itself was smaller, quieter, 3 people instead of 8, a dinner table where I could say something unfinished and nobody would reach for it before I was done with it. A phone call at 11 at night with Jana where I could say I was struggling, and she would say, "I know, me too sometimes," and that would be enough. A Saturday afternoon with Britt, who had started seeing her own therapist and who understood, in the specific embodied way that people understand things they are living through, what it means to be in the middle of rebuilding something. I went back to Dr. Haller's office in January. Cedar smell, old paper, the particular quality of silence in a room designed to hold difficult things. I sat down across from her and I told her what had happened, the whole arc of it, from the Tuesday morning when I first called to the birthday party to the quiet reconfiguration of my social world in the weeks that followed. She listened the way she always does, without performing, listening, just actually doing it. At the end, she said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "You did the work even when someone was watching. That's harder than doing it alone." I looked at the window. The light was still coming in sideways, the way it does in winter, but it was a different kind of sideways. Not the sideways of a Tuesday morning in October when you're in your bathrobe at 10:30 and your coffee has gone cold and you don't know yet what kind of year you're in. This was the sideways light of January, thinner and clearer, the kind that shows you exactly what's there. I thought about the coffee mug, that first morning, the bathrobe and the cold coffee, and the feeling that getting dressed was a decision I wasn't ready to make. I had made that decision every morning since. Some mornings it was easier than others, but I kept making it. I thought about Mia and what she had been looking for in my pain. I understood it, I think, even if I couldn't excuse it. She had been looking for importance, for centrality, for the feeling of being the person who knows the most, who is trusted the most, who is needed the most. She had been building a kind of architecture out of other people's private moments, and she had needed my vulnerability to be a brick in that building. What she hadn't understood was that my vulnerability was never a material for someone else's construction. It was mine. It was the thing I was using to rebuild myself. She took words. I kept the meaning. I got dressed that January morning, and I went to therapy, and I talked about things that were mine. And I walked home through cold air that smelled like exhaust and bread from a bakery on the corner, and I stopped and bought a coffee, a real one, hot, in a paper cup. And I stood on the sidewalk and drank it while it was still warm. That's the ending, not a confrontation, not a victory speech, just a woman standing on a sidewalk in January with a hot cup of coffee, knowing exactly who she is and exactly who she can trust, and finding that those two things are enough. More than enough, actually. Enough to start with.